Hi and welcome back to the Nook. I am finally back with a wrap-up video. I know it took me ages to do another wrap-up video, and I know most of you are not here for my wrap-up videos, unfortunately, I know that. But wrap-up videos have always been a consistent thing on my channel, and it's always been so amazing to put all these different books together. I know I go by a lot of thematic approaches a lot on this channel, but it's always good to see a lot of the connections across books in a chronological order, I guess in a much more linear manner, and to kind of let some connections appear spontaneously. So I'm not going to give out my wrap-ups, and I haven't done a wrap-up since June. I kind of feel like maybe a quarterly review might be better for me, in a sense of like my reading schedule tends to overlap a lot. Like I tend to read multiple books at once, and I tend to take really long for some books, and then I can read some in just like 2 days. So it doesn't really make sense to do monthly wrap-ups, because some months I only read like a book or 2 books, and some months I can finish like, I don't know, like 5 or 6. So it really depends, and I guess generally across 3 months I would have a substantial amount of books to share with everyone. So that hopefully puts off the pressure of having to read a certain number of books every month, which, by the way, you shouldn't feel the pressure to do that. Everyone has their own reading pace. What matters is that you reach your reading goals, as to what kind of books you want to read, and what kinds of genres you want to challenge yourself in, etc. That's a lot more important than reaching certain quantitative goals. Because you could just be reading one really influential book in a year, and that really changes the way that you think about the world, versus reading, like, I guess 50 books a year, not really thinking about the book, reflecting on it, and applying it to your life. So this kind of wrap-up is really more self-indulgent for me. It's a way for me to process my thoughts on these books, as well as share them with everyone, because I feel like I often read books I don't publicly share on my social media, and I kind of want to do that. I still feel like these books deserve mentions on my channel. So the very first book I want to talk about is The Growth Delusion by David Pilling. This is a book that was quite randomly picked up by me, I guess. It's a book about growth, economic growth, basically about the GDP, the obsession around it, and all that amazing stuff, which I think is a pretty common critique nowadays, but obviously it's not becoming super mainstream, although it is no longer considered such a radical idea anymore. The author of this book is a journalist. I think he's an economics journalist, and he has written many times for the Financial Times. I think he's still writing for that, and because he's a journalist, I do think his language is pretty accessible, although it is very economics based. So obviously it's an economics book, and it kind of just goes very deep into that inquiry of like value creation and transactions, and just very systematic look at the numbers themselves. Obviously it doesn't have like the numbers, the actual numbers in figures, but it does heavily talk about the significance of those numbers. So things like comparing GDP to the genuine progress index, or sort of like multiple different types of measurements of well-being that has been put forth by different countries and different policymakers, and talking about how economies around the world are structured so differently, to the point where just one single numerical indicator may not be the most accurate. Now, I want to go more into this line of inquiry of like economic growth furthermore in subsequent videos, but I'm not going to go too much into length in this video. You can watch like my previous videos on like degrowth and all that, where I did talk a little bit more about this concept of questioning economic growth and questioning alternative ways of measuring progress and well-being. I just want to put a statement out there that critiques of GDP tend to be downplayed a lot, because the fact that oftentimes GDP is strongly correlated with, a very tangible improvement in people's standards of living, which is true to some extent, and I would say that's completely legitimate. But at some point, you also start to wonder if, at what point does material progress really equate to much greater, much more substantial increases in well-being and sense of self. So I think that's the question that I want to dig deeper into in this channel. I would recommend it for people who are interested in the particular concept of GDP. It kind of reads like multiple articles in one book, and it gave me a pretty good overview of what GDP really consists of and what the alternatives are out there. However, it's just like a journalistic report, so it's not gonna give you any sort of hope that things might change around the notion of GDP, or that there are alternatives that should be pushed for. So there's definitely not a very strong radical voice in this book. Is really just for people to learn more about GDP and learn just a little bit of skepticism towards such a concept. Now, the next book that I read is a book by Bell Hooks, Feminism is for Everybody. And now I read this book as an audiobook, so I listened to it, and I think I read it like a few months back, so I probably read it in the month of June or July. I think in July, but I didn't talk about it at all. So feminism is always a big concept in my life, or theme in my life, and I've always started off with my huge love for like academic work through feminist theory and feminist work. So it was really nice to go back to that and to listen to Bell Hooks. I feel like this book is really accessible. I really think it kind of captures the holistic kind of approach of feminism to our pressing issues today. And I really love how Bell Hooks doesn't just talk about empowering a woman, but really empowering the idea of like choice and equality and love, and centering love in the middle of everything. And it's not just about pushing women to the forefront, because that is a very superficial take on what it means to be truly empowering and liberating for all. So I think it's a really good reminder of what a wholesome activism should look like. And I don't know whether I should use the word like wholesome, but I really do think that Bell Hooks' writing really conveys that kind of wholesomeness, like the idea that activism should be for everybody, that politics is for everyone, and it shouldn't be something that is guarded so closely by academic circles. It shouldn't be something that is only for the elite and the educated, because the fact is that most of us have encountered situations in society where we felt marginalized, or we felt misaligned, and these spaces are enough for anyone to contend with the way things work. And I think reading Bell Hooks was really a good way to get back into that mindset, because at that point I was washing the dishes at work in the cafe, and I was listening to Bell Hooks, and I felt really great. And I think that was an experience that really reminded me of why I wanted to do the things that I've been doing, which is reading books and sharing about these ideas. The belief that it's for everybody to enjoy, and that reading books and having this sort of really precious activity of being able to question your own ideals, but also engage with other people in critical discussion, that is something that should be permitted for everyone. Everyone should be able to do that, and it shouldn't be limited by, like, say, your educational background, or it shouldn't be limited by basically your different identities. So obviously this book is a very idealistic one, a very hopeful one, but I really enjoyed it. I feel like it is a very mood booster kind of book. So I realized I haven't been reading a lot of feminist books in my general life lately, and I really want to go back to that, because I feel like that is kind of like really energy giving to me. The next book that I read was Singa, Pura, and this is it's an anthology of short stories-ish, centering the Malay experience in Singapore. So I did talk about this book briefly in my, I think, recent Sing Lit collection haul thing. And this book, I really enjoyed it. I think it was really interesting to read a lot of the reviews that people left about the book. It's kind of melding futuristic elements with folklore or mythologies and kind of traditional understandings of like the Malay identity. I really enjoyed it. I think simply because I I've really been trying to focus a lot on my imaginative capacities, and it's always very good to expand alternatives, because oftentimes when we think of like technology and we think of the future, we tend to go off what we might see in the media, which tends to be very much dominated by a certain group of people in terms of their race and their class and their educational background. And even in Singapore, that's very much the case, where oftentimes what you see as signs of progress, they're very much spearheaded by a very specific group of people, which tend to be, of course, like Chinese male and in certain leadership positions. So it was really good to practice that, what if there are all these other things out there, and to put different identities in these different places. I think in Singapore, like, I'm actually really pleasantly surprised by how diverse and how good the short story collection scene is. So I feel like if you're ever interested in reading something lit, there are some short story collections that you can check out, I hope, that might give you a better glimpse into how it's like here culturally in this society, because I know it's a country with a lot of paradoxes that people seem to be very much intrigued by. So yeah, check them out if you want to. So the next book that I finished reading was The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. Now, if you want to really go deeper into what I have to say about this book, you can watch my other video that is about climate fiction, about the role of literature in the climate crisis. Basically, that entire video was inspired by this book, and I really cannot emphasize enough how much of a gem this book is, because I feel like Amitav Ghosh was really able to capture so many of the tensions that have not been articulated surrounding the climate crisis, and the way that we imagine or the way that we articulate fictional narratives, and even the boundaries between what is fiction and what is reality, basically narratives themselves. And I feel like reading this book has really given me so much breadth and like understanding what is it that we're telling ourselves in terms of the climate crisis, and even questioning the ways that we structure our lives, because I think a lot of people might not really understand the full power of like literature and understanding literature, but the fact is that literature actually oftentimes informs the way that we structure our memories, and informs the way that we see what is a coherent way of relating to the world. So the modern novel, the protagonist, with its setting, with the way that it, the character interacts with other people, that kind of reflects reality, but at the same time informs reality. So many great points in this book, and I'll definitely want to read it again. I think Amitav Ghosh has many great points about imperialism and colonialism and all that, and its impacts on the novel, the modern novel, and also how the modern novel informs the way that we think about ourselves in relation to our environment and in relation to the climate crisis. So it's a really great book, and I can't believe I didn't pick it up sooner. That's my only regret about this book. So highly recommend it. And currently now I'm reading this book called Anthropocene Fictions, which is a very similar theme to this book. So I'm still in the process of figuring out how they relate to each other, so keep an eye out for that. These two books I did talk about in my book on being ecological, and I am glad to report that I finished reading these two books. And the first book is Strangers, Essays on the Human and Non-Human by Rebecca Tamás, and this is a really small book. I don't know whether I talk about it on this channel. I really, seriously am struggling a lot with my memory nowadays. I really enjoyed it. I feel like this was such a productive critique of ecological works, and when I say productive, not saying it in the sense of like productive economically, obviously not, but productive in a way that like Tamás is able to say a lot with just a few words, and is able to deconstruct meanings in such a precise way and such a straightforward way that I really appreciate. So again, I feel like this book really captures that understanding of what's the relationship between creative work and our ecological understanding. The fact is that no matter how much science we know about the climate crisis, humans are creative beings, and the way that we relate to the world is oftentimes irrational. As much as we like to say as much as we like to portray ourselves as logical and reasonable, of course everyone would like to be seen that way because of the way that society is structured around logic and around rationale. But the fact is, a lot of us are unable to explain why we stick to certain beliefs so strongly, and I think that can only really be dissected by creative inquiry into sort of expanding the human psyche and expanding our understanding beyond our sort of material selves, which I think this book did really well. I think Rebecca Tamás is such an excellent writer, and I really want to read her other books if possible. The next book on my list is Entangled Life: How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds and Shape Our Futures by Merlin Sheldrake. So this is a pretty fun non-fiction to read, even if you're not interested in climate change or the climate crisis. It's a really joyous book. It's like a very fun and very entertaining and very inspiring sort of book, and it's kind of rare for a non-fiction to do that. I think it really brings you back to your younger days when you were just so in awe of a lot of natural stuff, a lot of nature. And so this book is really just about mushrooms. I mean, it's just about fungi, and it's about the amazing world of fungi that we still haven't really much discovered. And I'm just so astounded by fungi now. I'm just really astounded by the kind of mutualistic understandings that fungi can help us discover, the way that we've been studying science, how then the study of fungi can really change that, and fundamentally change the way that we see ourselves in relation to the world. I definitely do see fungi playing a very huge role in how we might envision a much more ecologically healthy environment, because mushrooms do a lot of that. Mushrooms do a lot of the heavy work in ecology. They're the ones that spread information, allowing trees to connect with one another. So really there's a lot of potential in mycelium, and in that understanding ourselves, there's so much to know about ourselves through the study of mushrooms. Of course, the study of mushrooms themselves it sounds like a really fun thing, and I love how there's a strong sense of amateur science that's associated with fungi that you don't really see with other fields of science. There are tons of videos about mushrooms in that way, so go ahead and watch them. I think they're super intriguing. I find them super fun, and it really brings back that joy of science for me. Next, I actually did read some clifi as inspired by my recent inquiries into climate fictions and all that. So the first book that I read was Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. So this is kind of like a classic. I know a lot of people tout this book as like the it book when it comes to talking about climate apocalypse and talking about mutual aid and collective action. Actually, the biggest takeaway that I had from this book was the role of religion and the role of spiritual belief in collective action and in resilience. Octavia Butler, when she first wrote this book, it was in the 90s, and she said this in the 2020s or 2030s. So that is maybe about 30 years predicted from when she was writing this book, but now it's kind of like 10 years in the future-ish kind of time frame. And when I first started reading the book, it kind of struck me how real some of these situations could be. The idea of like police corruption, the idea of like class divide, the idea of general collapse of the majority of the population, food scarcity, constant climate degradation. The way that Butler set up the scene was kind of terrifying, but it was also kind of validating in a way that she was able to imagine collapse and then envision a way that people can survive the collapse. And I thought that was the most amazing part, because it's easier to sort of envision the end and sort of distance yourself from that scenario and think that it will never happen. But what if it actually happens right now, and what would you be able to do? So I think that is like the really amazing part about this book that I was able to learn so much from, learning the idea of resilience, the understanding of trust when things collapse, and what it really means on a very basic level to have collective empathy. And I think that is such a simple message, but it was so strongly delivered. It gave me a lot of things to think about. There was just so much violence going on, like violence and exploitation, but I kind of feel that that's kind of the way that the world works now as well. And it's about characters who have to move through this history of exploitation and the history of this huge sense of like protectionism and guardedness. How do you move past that, and how do you start to build from scratch? And I think that's such a powerful message to hold on to, especially during these times. So I felt like the book was great. I really captured that, and I really want to read the next book. I think Parable of the Talent or something. This whole series kind of reminds me of a point that I made about the role of religion and the role of spirituality in the climate crisis, which I kind of talked about in my Dear Future Letter series, which I haven't been doing. Apologize for that. And I feel like this book was a really clear manifestation of that, how that would take place. So the next book that I read was The Man with the Compound Eyes by Wu Ming-Yi. It is a Taiwanese author, and the author is someone who does a lot of research in the environment as well. So he's also a professor, if I'm not wrong. So it's pretty interesting. It has a very strong environmental theme throughout the entire book, and it takes place sort of like in the speculative present future scenario. I'm not really sure if it happens in the past or right now, but I think it's kept a bit ambiguous that way. And I really, really enjoyed it. I know that some people have described it as a bit choppy in its narrative, with a lot of characters that you can't keep up with. In response to this, I want to talk about Amitav Ghosh's point on linearity in narrative telling, and how that doesn't really capture the idea of the climate crisis. The fact is, climate crisis is going to be non-linear. It's going to be multi-narrative or like multi-linear. I don't know what the term is, but it's going to be happening at the same scale, at different scales at the same time for everyone. And the fact is that it's going to be happening in pockets of time that are all fragmented, and it's the roles of the story to be able to craft an understanding of all these separate pockets of time in a still relatively coherent way. And I think Wu Ming-Yi was actually able to do that for me. I feel like it wasn't really necessary to really remember every single character's backstory to the T, but it was very important to understand that all these things were happening at the same time. It's a bit magical realism, I guess, but it's also kind of like I read it as a kind of commentary on what we understand as indigenous, or what we understand as having this mythical relationship to the land. There was this one scene that I really, really felt was so impactful. It was the scene where Alice, the main character, and the other main character, which is Atelier, I think, I can't really pronounce his name. I don't know whether that's a Chinese character pronunciation. I should go and check it out. But anyway, it's when this young kind of indigenous or boy, or mythical, he's from like a mythical land, and he asks the main character, Alice, if there is God on the mountains, because oftentimes folklores will talk about gods in the mountains and gods in the seas, and the main character was like, no, there's no such god on the mountain. And then while they were hiking through the forest, they actually encountered a bear. This is a spoiler, I guess, but it's not really a huge spoiler. They encountered a bear, and in that particular moment, because the bear was just so scary and so humongous, and I guess in a way quite splendid, and so in this situation, the boy commented, there is a god on this mountain. I feel like that is what we all lack nowadays. We lack this feeling of profoundness when we interact with nature. And I want to link down to a YouTube video below that helped me understand this a bit better. Yeah, we lack this kind of deeper connection to nature and a deeper understanding of what it means to be a small part of this huge ecological web, to the point where we don't even see how the world actually looks like. We don't actually see or don't actually understand the fact that there's so many things beyond our comprehension that's out there in the world right now. And it was this scene that reinforced the importance of folk tales or folklore or mystical or mythical understandings of the world, because those capture our understandings of nature so much better than what kind of rational explanation that we could make about science and the world through science. So not saying that I don't believe in science. I think science is the way that we understand the world through our human understanding, but the fact is there's still many things that require more than just a human understanding for us to really be compelled to do things, or compelled to like keep the way that the world is going on. I don't know whether that makes sense. I hope it makes sense. In terms of whether I would recommend this book, I would recommend it. I feel like it's pretty rare to be able to find such a narrative style like this. Not just the setting itself, which is in Taiwan, and the different characters that you encounter in the book. I also feel it's really meaningful to be able to see all these things at play in one novel. At first I was pretty confused why it was called a novel, but I realized that it's because I approached the book with a very general assumption of how novels are supposed to work. And I think if you approach the book in that kind of open-ended way, that kind of open-minded way, it would be a very meaningful book to pick up as well. So the last book that I read, which I just finished reading this morning actually, is called The Refusal of Work, Rethinking Post-Work Theory and Practice by David Frayne? I don't know. It was published in 2015, and yeah, I mean, going off the entire thread of work in my channel, those are the videos that tend to do really well. So I know somewhat there is a general sense of disillusionment going on amongst people with regards to the meaning of work and kind of questioning the role of work in our society. And I think this book is great, especially for those of you who are looking to kind of find a much more concrete understanding of what the meaning and what the value of work is. Now, I know some people might very easily brush this all aside and say that people are just being lazy, etc., which is something the author addresses in this book. But I do think that there is a difference between work as labor, which means work as something that produces value, whether tangible or intangible, versus paid work or paid employment, where it is kind of a societal structure of things, going into a physical place to clock in, being obligated to certain people in power, positions, performing tasks that are not necessarily productive, or performing tasks that are laborious without sufficient safety regulations. These are all elements of paid employment, which is separate from the idea of work itself. So what I really enjoyed about this book was that it had three very distinct parts. The first was a theoretical understanding, a theoretical discussion of work itself and its relation to society. And the second part was an ethnographic inquiry into how life might look like if you don't have work at the center of it. So I think the author kind of had this qualitative research with about 5 participants or more, 5 to 10 participants, all of whom had a sort of different relationship to work. Either they were unable to work because of certain disabilities or incapacities, but it also spanned all the way to people who very actively opted out of work and chose to do other sorts of things, whether it's based on their savings or based on sort of lowering their levels of spending. So I felt it was really useful to have that second part, because most discussions on work in a kind of academic way tends to neglect how it actually functions in real life. And through this ethnographic inquiry, there's also a lot of talk about feelings of shame and how joblessness and unemployment was being framed in a particular moralistic way, which I feel like was such a great addition to the discussion about work that other books I've seen about work don't really discuss. Now, the last part was a very useful sort of aspirational look to the future, where I think the author did a really great job at being practical and realistic when talking about work, where, you know, ideally you could have a utopia where everyone worked a lot less, there's employment for all, there's also, you know, meaningful work for everyone to do, and that your value and, you know, your meaning in life isn't tied to the economic value that you produce, but rather to your personhood. So that is the ideal utopia, but I'm really glad that the author also took a step back and talked about the realistic approaches to get there, which is, you know, things like fighting for a much more balanced working schedule, fighting for much more safety regulations, fighting for financial security, so things like universal basic income, especially for people who are unable to work, not just because they are disabled, but could be because of many other capacities as well. Maybe they are a caregiver, maybe they are doing a lot of other things that we might not know that puts them out of conventional work. So I think this was a really great book to read and to sort of very much clarify ideas of work in today's society. And I think a lot of you will really enjoy this book as well. I just feel like it was a very good mix of kind of ethnographic approaches, but also a lot of sufficient academic rigor, as well as enough kind of hope and inspiration towards the very last part. The author also provided really great calls to action, which is something that is so rare in a lot of books, and I really appreciate it when authors are able to articulate what a very realistic or practical call to action might look like. And in this case, the author is talking a lot about how we should start having much more conducive discussions about work that do not induce kind of moralistic judgments about people. So not viewing unemployment in a necessarily negative way, not viewing affluence and sort of high stress jobs as a kind of noble sacrifice. I think these are things that we can start with in terms of questioning the role of work, etc. And especially, what does value mean? Going back to the very first book that I mentioned in this video, The Growth Delusion, it's also questioning about what value is and how we measure that in terms of the economy, and whether we should really be so tied to economic rationales, or whether we should be really so tied to using the economy as an indicator for everything else, not necessarily having to completely delegitimize economies, but to sort of question the balances and the roles that each different thing plays. That is all for all my books. I think for the very last book, I am kind of inspired to do a completely separate video just on that book alone and talking about work, because I know a lot of people are very interested in a post-work or like a degrowth economy and a degrowth world where we all sort of work a lot less but still maintain similar productive levels and similar sort of like, I guess not similar, but comfortable levels of living, that I don't know how that might look like in the face of the climate crisis, which by the way is, COP26 is happening soon, so keep your eye out for that. So that's all for my wrap up. I haven't done these in a long while and I really enjoyed it, so I hope you can see that there's pretty common trend across the books I'm reading nowadays. I am still reading through my my library haul as well, a lot of books on my TBR now that I finally have the time to really start to catch up on the books. So I'm very glad to report that I'm now able to free up more time to read books and to share more ideas with everyone. Thanks so much for sticking with me till the very end of this video. I hope it was enjoyable for you all. And I guess that's it for this wrap up. Yeah, life has been really nice to me lately. I'm really glad and I'm really grateful. So I hope that life has been alright to you. I'm not really sure how you're doing wherever you are, but I hope that you're having a good day. If not, I do hope you have a good night's rest tonight, and I hope to see you soon in the next video. So thanks so much. Take care, and I'll see you. Cool.